is Brian Beams, and I'm an international trade specialist with the U.S. Commercial Service Office located in northern New Jersey. Also on the line today, we have Anthony Sargis, who sits in the Connecticut office. On behalf of the U.S. Commercial Service, the Connecticut, New Jersey, San Diego, and Imperial District Export Councils, and the law firm of Wiggin and Dana, we welcome all of you to today's webinar titled Export Controls at Trade Shows. A couple of items to note before we get started. Be sure you are connected using both your telephone and the online WebEx platform, which enables you to see the virtual presentation. Also, all telephone lines are currently on mute. We will open the lines up for questions at the end of the presentation. We will also take questions submitted through the Q&A and chat features on your WebEx platform. I'd like to take a minute to inform the audience about the U.S. Commercial Service. We are the trade and investment arm of your federal government. We are the vision of the International Trade Administration. Our mission is to promote U.S. exports, protect U.S. commercial interests abroad, and facilitate foreign direct investment in America. We have offices all around the world. Domestically, we are located in almost every state, with about having 108 offices nationwide. Internationally, we have offices in about 70 countries at your embassies and consulates around the world. Final item, our web URL has changed. Please note that all U.S. Commercial Service information can now be found on www.trade.gov. Here's a list of our remaining webinars of this export compliance series. All 10 webinars will be recorded, hopefully this one as well, and presentations will be forwarded to you every Friday morning at 9 a.m. Right, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Talia Townsend, with the law firm of Wiggin and Dana. Talia is a graduate of the Yale Law School, a former federal law clerk, and the current co-chair of the International Trade Compliance Group. She is an experienced international trade compliance counselor and federal civil litigator, trusted by Fortune 500 corporations, defense contractors, major universities, and small businesses. Talia leads a team of seasoned associates with a sophistication to take on the challenges of trade compliance. She has conducted hundreds of internal investigations into potential violations of U.S. export and sanctions, and teaches classes on international trade compliance at the University of Connecticut School of Law. Talia also assists U.S. and international clients in classifying products, analyzing regulatory requirements, obtaining export licenses, training employees, and conducting voluntary or direct site audits. Without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Talia.
Thank you very much indeed, and thanks for inviting me to speak today. Hello, everybody. It's good to have you back if you joined us last week when I also gave a presentation, and if you didn't, nice to meet you all. We're going to talk about export controls at trade shows today. So let's dive right into it, and I look forward to getting your questions at the end. First thing we're going to talk about is how exports happen at overseas trade shows. I'm going to focus on overseas trade shows rather than U.S. domestic trade shows, which don't pose the same export control issues. We're going to talk about ITAR and EAR authorizations for those trade shows, and then we're going to talk about a few other considerations, different parts of the regulations that might come up that are not quite so obvious as the export control issues. And then we'll just wrap up with a kind of handy-dandy checklist that you can use for your trade shows going forward. All right, let's see. So how do exports happen at trade shows? Little reminder here, I know you've had various webinars, and I know many of you are experienced export compliance professionals, so I'm sure this is obvious, but just to make sure everybody is on the same page, let's talk about what an export is so that you can think about how exports would happen at trade shows. Well, the first and most obvious is an actual shipment or transmission out of the United States or from one foreign country to another, which we call a re-export. And this would apply if you're actually taking something. So that could be hardware, or it could be controlled information that you're taking in the form of brochures, posters, handouts. So not just the hardware, but also the information if you're taking it in physical form. It could also be information that is on a laptop or a telephone, a mobile device of some kind, or on a dongle. If you're taking that out of the country, that's an export. In addition, there are intangible exports. So if you export information by releasing controlled information or software to a foreign person, whether that is overseas or if it happens in the United States, we call it a deemed export. That's not going to be so important for today because we're not talking about things that happen in the U.S. We're talking about when you go to a trade show. But even at a foreign trade show, if you release information to a person who is a national of a different country than the one you're in, they're in France and you're talking to a German, that would be, if you release technical information, that would also be a deemed export. We'd call it a deemed re-export because you're re-exporting it from France to Germany in that scenario. So actual shipment or transmission, release of information to a foreign person, which could occur verbally, you're talking to them and you tell them something technical that is controlled, or it could occur by visual disclosure. What do I mean by that? Well, you might show them a blueprint or a specification or something else technical in nature, but you might also show them hardware which itself reveals technical information. For example, if you take a disassembled module with you to the trade show and you show it in its disassembled state, a cross-section, something like that, it's possible that looking at that might reveal technical information. If so, that would be an export of that information. Another way it can happen is if you provide access information, encryption keys, login information to a system that contains technical data. But that isn't likely to happen at a trade show, so we won't focus on that. There are some other things that constitute exports. This doesn't come up so often, but transfer to a foreign person of registration, control, or ownership of certain kinds of ITAR-controlled aircraft, vessel, and satellites also is an export, even if the actual aircraft or vessel is not exported at that moment in time. So if you were to go ahead and make a sale at a trade show and they were to sign on the dotted line, that potentially, if it was the right kind of item, could be an export too. And then there is this business of defense services. This only comes up under the ITAR. It only comes up with respect to defense articles, that is, items that are on the United States munitions list. But if you are providing assistance to foreign persons with respect to the operation, maintenance, repair, design, development, production, or use of such an item, that would be an export. We call it a defense service. And this can come up at trade shows through demonstrations of how to operate products that you are trying to sell or advertise at those trade shows if those items are ITAR controlled. And the last one, transfer of a defense article to a foreign embassy in the U.S., not really relevant for trade shows, so let's move on. So now you know the definitions, and I think you already knew the definitions of export, so let's think about how they apply. Actual shipment or transmission out of the U.S., well, when you go to a trade show, typically you're taking hardware with you to the trade show to display. That would be an export. You might be taking product brochures, as I mentioned before, or posters or flyers. Those also are being exported in that case. Displaying hardware, as I mentioned, that can be an export if the display of the hardware reveals information that itself is controlled under U.S. export law. And then if you display or distribute the brochures, then you are exporting them again, potentially to the country. The information in them is being exported to the country of the person who receives them. So if you go to an air show in Paris, not all of the people there are going to be French. There are going to be people from all over the world, and so there will be many exports of the information to many different countries, all of the different countries represented by the people at the trade show. As I mentioned, if you conduct a product demonstration, then that also can include a couple of different kinds of export. The physical hardware that you're demonstrating is not being exported via the demonstration, but information, technical information related to how to operate that item would be potentially exported by the demonstration. And if that item is ITAR controlled, then that would be called the defense service, and you'd be exporting the defense service. Another way that exports can occur, remember we talked about the fact that exports can occur through verbal disclosures of technical information. If somebody comes by at the trade show, comes by to your booth, and they start asking technical questions about the product, if you reveal that technical information in response to their questions, you would be exporting that information to them and to whichever country it is that they come from. Now, sometimes with trade shows, those are the ones I've described, those are the obvious things that happen because they're the purpose of going to a trade show. You go to show off your products and discuss them with potential prospects. But in the process of getting to the trade show and sending personnel there, some incidental exports can occur. In particular, when your personnel leave, they typically have a laptop with them. They have iPhones that have, or Samsung Galaxies or whatever it may be, that have emails on them. People have all kinds of documents. And when you take those items out of the country, you're technically exporting the information that is on them. And if that information is controlled, you might need authorization. That's a kind of incidental export. Oftentimes, personnel still have a job to do while they're at the trade show, and they may receive phone calls from work asking them questions about things they have to do. If somebody, a foreign person not associated with your business, not authorized, is in your vicinity when you answer those questions, you might verbally disclose, they may hear technical information. That could be another kind of incidental export. Or if you whip out your laptop to do a little bit of work because business is slow at the booth at the trade show and somebody comes behind you, can see the screen, that could also be an export. So those would be examples of incidental exports. They're not the purpose of the trade show, but they can happen while you're there. So how do we authorize all of this? If you're going to have an export, you need to make a determination either that no authorization is required for that export, or that authorization is required from the U.S. government and that you have it. Now, as you know from other webinars, there are a couple of different types of authorization. You might actually get a license from the U.S. government, which you apply for in advance, and they actually give you a license. These days it's electronic. It used to be paper, but still there's an actual license. In other circumstances, you don't need to apply because you can use a license that's been written into the regulations. It's all there. It's available for anybody who can satisfy the conditions, and those are called under the ITAR exemptions and under the EAR exceptions. So these kinds of authorizations we're going to talk about. But before we get there, there are some, this is the good news, there are some items for which you don't need any export authorization. So if you're taking them to a trade show overseas, you do not need to obtain authorization in order to put them in the suitcase or put them in the FedEx box and send them to the trade show. What kinds of things are those? Well, let's start at the bottom of the slide. They are never hardware. You always need some kind of authorization for hardware. It is never not subject to the regulations. But information sometimes is not subject to the regulations at all. And because it's not subject to the regulations, you don't have to obtain authorization for it. Pretty limited circumstances in which that's true, but they are if you have basic marketing information, not proprietary in nature, and it only describes at a very high level the function and purpose of the system. This is not a technical document, doesn't give away the secret source, it's not full of parameters and dimensions and images that show the internal workings of the document, just very high level basic marketing information. That is exempt. It's considered not subject to the regulations. It's excluded from control. And you can see on the slide the citations to where you can find that rule in the ITAR and the EAR. What else is exempt? Information that is exactly the same as the information in a published patent or public patent application. In theory, you could take that information and turn it into a product brochure, and that would not be subject to the regulations. Now, under the EAR and the ITAR, there are slightly different rules for another category of information. Under the EAR, you can always choose to release information, even if it would otherwise be controlled, to the public without restriction, publish it widely to everybody. Everybody can get a hold of it. Under those circumstances, the information is published. According to the EAR, it is no longer subject to the regulations. They figure that if it's really important information, it's going to be proprietary and the company won't want to release it. And if you choose to release it, it's probably not that important. However, that trick doesn't work under the ITAR. The rule under the ITAR is different. Under the ITAR, information that is in the public domain is not subject to the regulations. But in order for it to get into the public domain, you have to have it released first by the cognizant government agency. It might be the Air Force, it might be the Department of the Navy. Once they have approved it for public release, then you can go ahead and release it for unlimited distribution. And at that point, it enters the public domain and is no longer subject to the regulations. But you can't just publish it without getting permission from the government first under the ITAR. It's a two-step process. If you follow that process, so you have information that has been approved for public release, it was ITAR controlled, the government approves its release, and then you can release it at a trade show without authorization. So that's the good stuff. And this often, for trade shows, this typically works for the marketing information. But when you prepare the information, you obviously want to make sure with your compliance officials that it does satisfy these requirements. It is only high-level marketing information, or it has been approved for public release by the government agency. Sometimes people get carried away with marketing materials. They get a nice photograph from somewhere. They want to add it, and it turns out that the photograph reveals technical information. Perhaps somewhere in the photograph there's a close-up of a disassembled product, and that could reveal technical information. So it's very important to have those materials reviewed and confirmed to be not subject to the regulations before you export them without authorization. So no authorization required. That's bucket number one. What else? Let's talk about the ITAR and how you get authorization for items that are subject to the International Traffic in Arms Regulations. I think everybody on the line is familiar with this, but let me just say, in case anybody's wondering, she keeps saying ITAR, what does she mean? The International Traffic in Arms Regulations is the ITAR, and it controls items that are described on the United States Munitions List, the USML. And those items tend to be sensitive military products developed for use by the military. So ITAR authorization, if you have items that are described on the USML and information related to those items, to their development, production, maintenance, operation, repair, et cetera, will also be subject to the ITAR. So if you have ITAR products and you want to take them to a trade show and you want to take associated information, how can you authorize that? Well, let's start in the top left-hand corner of the slide. There's a very nice-sounding exemption. Remember, I said an exemption is a license that's available for everybody. It's written into the regulations, so it is a kind of authorization. And this one is for temporary exports to exhibitions and shows. Sounds perfect. Sounds like just the thing you need for a trade show. What does it apply to? Well, it's almost perfect, but it's not as perfect as it sounds because there is a condition in it that requires you to already have a license, an actual license that you applied for from the government for the items that you're trying to take. Let's have a look at the detail here, and then we'll come back to this slide. So the exemption is in here, 123.16, part of the ITAR, and it's actually 123.16.5, so it's the bottom portion of this slide. And as you can see, it says that the CBP shall permit the export without a license of unclassified defense articles to any public exhibition, trade show, air show, or related event. But here comes the catch. If that article has previously been licensed for a public exhibition, trade show, etc., and the license is still valid. So in order to use this license exemption, you have to previously have obtained a license for exactly the same items to another trade show. So perhaps you've got permission to take items A, B, and C to a trade show in France. If that license is still valid, then when you want to go to a trade show in Germany, you can take those items. You don't have to use the original license. It doesn't cover Germany. It only covers France. But so long as it covers exactly the same items and it's still valid, it has not expired, then you can use it in conjunction with this exemption, or you can use the exemption relying on the existence of the license, to be more accurate, to take the same items to a trade show in Germany. Now, there are some other restrictions associated with this license. They're not on the face of Section 5. So if you look at the bottom of the screen, you won't see these restrictions. They are in the preamble at the very top of the section. And so that's the first portion of this slide up here, 123.16a. There are some very general carve-outs. And when you read those, which for some reason on this slide, it's showing up as redactions. I apologize. I will fix that in the PDF. It doesn't show up that way on my screen, but now that I look at it here, it looks like you can't see the text that's underneath the yellow. So sorry for the confusion there. But if you could see the text that's underneath the yellow, then you would see that in that general introduction to 123.16, it excludes items that are subject to the Missile Technology Control Regime and also items that are significant military equipment. So those cannot go to trade shows using this exemption. It also cannot be used if the trade show is in an arms embargoed country. It's generally a big restriction on ITAR-related activities. There are quite a lot of those countries that are enumerated in Section 126.1 of the ITAR, and it includes countries, sometimes surprising to people, China and Cyprus, for example, which is in the EU, is also a 126.1 country. So there are some restrictions. So sometimes this exemption is of limited use. You can't use it the first time you go to a trade show with ITAR-controlled items because you won't already have a license. You have to have had a license, and it still has to be valid. And you can't use it for all items. You have to make sure they're not NTCR, not SME, and that you're not going to a 126.1 country. So what can you do if you can't use the trade show exemption? What are your other options? Well, let's pop back to the prior slide for a second. Let's see. Well, you might be able to use, if you go down to the bottom left-hand corner of that slide, the 123.16b4, so it's the same section of the ITAR but a different subsection, exemption for models and mock-ups. This exemption allows you to take to the trade show items which are models and mock-ups of defense articles, but not the defense article themselves. It's not any model and mock-up. There are conditions in this exemption that say that it must be inoperable, can't be operational, and it must not contain ITAR-controlled components. So if it's got a bunch of stuff inside, you have to pull all of that out if it's ITAR-controlled before you can call it a model or mock-up for purposes of this exemption. And also looking at the model or mock-up can't reveal any technical data for which you don't have authorization. And the exemption it says explicitly, as an example, that sometimes if you make a model or mock-up to scale, the dimensions are all correct, that would reveal technical data necessary for the production of that item. Tell somebody what dimensions to use. That would be controlled. And so it wouldn't fit within the scope of the exemption unless you had separate authorization to reveal that technical data. Sometimes if you make it out of controlled materials, that can also cause the model or mock-up not to fit within the exemption. So it has limited utility, but it's quite handy for taking those little miniature versions of defense articles that are made out of plastic and that don't have any of the capabilities of the defense article, but that look nice hung around the booth. You can use the model or mock-up exemption for that. What if neither of those ones will work for you, but you happen to be going to Canada, then there's still another possibility for using an exemption. There is an exemption in 126.5 of the ITAR specifically for Canada, so a series of exemptions. And the Canadian exemption allows a number of things, but amongst them, it allows temporary export to Canada, temporary export, for return to the United States. So that would be a condition that's normally satisfied when you want to go to a trade show. You're going temporarily, you're bringing things back. Under those circumstances, you could use this exemption for a trade show in Canada, but you can't use it for items that have an X in the Canada column of Supplement 1 to Part 126. I just want to show you what that looks like because it is sometimes a little bit difficult to navigate. So this, for example, these two slides here, these are just excerpts from Supplement 1 to Part 126. You can see that there's a column for Canada. In the original next to that, there's a column for UK and a column for Australia too. And I just cut and pasted the ones that have an X. There are a bunch that don't have an X, but then they wouldn't fit on slides. But you can see that there are a number of things that are carved out. If there is an X, then you cannot use the Canadian exemption for it. And I had highlighted some, and again, I'm afraid my highlighting looks like you just can't read through it. We'll fix that in the PDF. But amongst other things, for example, firearms are excluded, technology for gas turbine engines for ITAR-controlled aircraft is excluded. There are a number of things that are excluded, and you really have to go very carefully through the supplement to determine if you can use that exemption or not. Go back to it for a second. You also can't use the Canadian exemption if you're going from one foreign trade show to Canada afterwards. So let's say you go to a trade show in Spain and then you want to go to a trade show in Canada right away, you wouldn't be able to use the exemption in those circumstances because you cannot transit a third country. That's part of the fine print of that exemption. Now, if you do choose to use one of those exemptions, then just like using a license under the ITAR, you are required to document the fact that you can comply with the conditions. And in fact, in two of these cases, the temporary export to exhibitions and the models and mock-ups, you have to certify your compliance to CBP. And you submit that certification at the same time as you submit your electronic export information. You use the ACE system to do that. But you have to certify to CBP that you've complied with the conditions. You don't have to certify for the Canadian exemption, but you do need to have an internal record showing that you considered whether you could fulfill the conditions, and then you have to keep that record, like all records for export control purposes, for 5 years after the event concludes. So when you get back from the trade show, it needs to stay in the file for 5 years after that, so that you can show the DDTC that you did your due diligence, you made sure you had authorization, and that you complied with the requirements of the ITAR. Now, if you cannot satisfy any of the exemptions, then you can apply for a license. And there are two kinds of licenses that you often will need for a trade show if you're going to exhibit ITAR-controlled items. The first, for the hardware, would be the DSP-73. That is a temporary export license. And a DSP just means Department of State pro forma, and they call it a DSP-73. This would only cover hardware. Why? Because technical data cannot be temporarily exported. Perhaps technical data on paper can be, but if you want to share technical information or you want to do product demonstrations, well, once that information is in somebody's brain, they've seen it, they've heard it, you can't take it back. So that's always necessarily a permanent export. The DSP-73, like any ITAR license, is only valid for exactly what you ask for. So exactly the items that you ask for, in exactly the quantity that you ask for, and exactly the value that you ask for. They're very, very limited in that way. They're very specific. It's like a driver's license that says you can only drive up certain streets and you always have to turn right. It's very narrow in that way, so you really have to pay attention to those conditions. You can't transfer title. It's a temporary export. And you have to keep track that you don't exceed the quantity and value on the license. In addition, the Department of State, from time to time, DDTC, will impose provisos that restrict some features of the items that you can export, or otherwise impose conditions requiring how you secure those items, where you store them at the trade show. And so you have to read those provisos very carefully to make sure that you don't exceed the scope of the license. In addition, licenses are not issued overnight, so if you're going to need a license for a trade show, you've got to let the compliance team know ahead of time so that they can prepare the application and submit it and wait for the Department of State to respond. What about the technical data? What about if you want to release technical data? It doesn't happen that often at trade shows because typically you're not trying to give away the secret source and reveal technical information. But if for some reason you needed to, or you need to conduct a demonstration, this is how it comes up more often, you want to conduct a demonstration which will show something about the operation of the item. Well, that's a defense service. Remember, assistance to foreign persons in the operation, amongst other things, of a defense article. You have to have authorization for that. So a DSP-5 is the right authorization for that. It's a permanent export license. And again, it's only valid for the parties and the items, the services that are listed on the license. Quantities and values have to be tracked, and it may have provisos that you have to watch out for. And like using exemptions, if you use a license, you have to create a record of exactly what you are doing that requires the authorization, how what you're planning to do satisfies the authorization, and keep it on file for 5 years after the event. That's the ITAR piece of this. We talked about things that don't require any authorization, then we talked about things that require ITAR authorization. What about if you have items that are not subject to the ITAR, but are subject to U.S. export controls? They're going to be subject to the EAR, the Export Administration Regulations. How do you authorize taking those to trade shows? Let's take a look. Oh, going the wrong way, sorry about that. Slides that I'm skipping over just give the detail of those ITAR exemptions and licenses. Okay, so for the EAR, now I said there were things that are not subject to the regulations. There are also things that are subject to the EAR. That's really anything that is not in the not subject to regulations bucket and also not subject to the ITAR. And those could be very non-sensitive items like spectacles or plastic bottles or pens. These are all subject to the EAR, but they are not listed or described on the Commerce Control List, the CCL. And so they are designated as EAR 99. That just means something that is subject to the regulations, but that is not very sensitive, and so it's only controlled for limited purposes. So if you have EAR 99 items, the authorization for exporting those is no license required. They are subject, so you do need authorization, but the authorization is just the fact that they don't require a license, NLR, no license required. That's what you'll write on the electronic export information in certain circumstances. So EAR 99 items, generally freely exportable, except to embargoed countries. So if the trade show were in Cuba or Iran or Syria or North Korea or the Crimea region of Ukraine, it may not be possible to take items to those countries as under the no license required authorization. And in fact, you'd have other questions to consider, for example, whether economic sanctions even allow you to go to a trade show in such a country. But setting aside the embargoed countries issue, EAR 99, generally freely exportable, you can take those to a trade show without obtaining written authorization and without using a license exception or an exemption under the ITAR. There's another bucket of items for which you may not require a license or a license exception, and those would be hardware that is on the Commerce Control List. So it isn't EAR 99. It is on the Commerce Control List, but it doesn't require a license to the particular country that you are going to. And as I'm sure everybody knows, the way you figure that out under the EAR is that you look at something called the Commerce Country Chart. It has a long list of the reasons for control for the item at the top and the countries down the side. And if you look and see if there's an X in the box, and if there's no X in the box that corresponds to the reason for control in the country, then you can export that item without a license to that country. So you may have items that are no license required for France, in which case you can take them to a trade show in France without obtaining an license and without using a license exception. But those same items might be license required for a trade show in Colombia. And at that point, you would not be able to take them no license required. You would have to get a license or use a license exception. So that's how that works. Now, I said only hardware that is on the CCL and is no license required. And why did I say that? Well, when you go to a trade show, as I mentioned before, there are lots of people from around the world there, so lots of different foreign nationalities. So let's say you're going to a trade show in France, the hardware might be no license required for France. That's great. And you're not going to export the hardware when you're in France. You're not going to transfer it further to foreign persons. You might transfer technical information related to it by exhibiting it, but you're not going to actually export it any further. But the information related to that hardware, which typically will have a similar level of control to the hardware, that is going to be exported to people from all over the world, not just France, Germany, Spain, Colombia, wherever. If you share that information, if you exhibit the hardware and it reveals technical information, that's going to many different countries. And so you can't say in advance that it would be no license required because you don't know all of those countries. So for the information, you're going to have, for the technical information, you're going to have a separate kind of authorization. You won't just be able to export it, no license required. I hope that all makes sense. So that's the good news bucket, right? Things you don't need to get a license or use an exception for. What if you have something that is controlled, a piece of hardware that is controlled to the country that you want to take it, or information relating to hardware that is not itself license required, but the information that you want to transmit requires a license for other countries, and you don't know who is going to be at the trade show? What can you do? There is license exception TMP, which is at 740.9A5 of the EAR, and it is sort of the equivalent to the trade shows exemption under the ITAR that we talked about. But TMP is a very complicated license exception. It has numerous subsections, and we're just talking about one of the subsections, A5. That's the one that is focused on temporary exports to air shows, exhibitions, trade shows, etc. Now, it allows temporary exports of commodities and software, and it allows them to be taken to trade shows, etc., but only for 1 year. They have to come back within a year, and they cannot be exhibited or demonstrated at any one location for more than 120 days. You could go from one location to another, 120 days, 2 of them, and then come back, and you'd still be within the year. But there is a limit on 120 days at each site. Typically a problem. People don't usually go for more than 120 days, but still that's in the requirements. When you use TMP, you cannot demonstrate the item, or you cannot use it for more than the absolute minimum necessary for effective demonstration. So you can't get into great detail about how to operate the item or anything else. That's a limitation on the use of the license exception. There are some limitations on what you can take under it. So it's not available for all ECCNs. Unsurprisingly, there are some restrictions on 600 series items. Those are the more sensitive items that used to be on the USML and came over to the CCL in the last few years. You can't use it for those if the trade show is in a D5 country, a country that is in country group D5 of the EAR. And for Cuba, there is a different license exception. Again, Cuba is a country subject to embargoes, and so there may be other regulations that you have to think about. From the perspective of the EAR, you would have to use something called license exception SCP. If you use TMP, temporary, there are time limits, there are limits on exactly what you can take. In addition, you have to maintain control of the items, effective control, which could be controlled by your company or controlled by an agent of your company, but the item has to remain within your effective control. And obviously you have to maintain ownership, otherwise the export is not temporary. You also have some requirements for filling out the export documentation associated with the license exception. Now I just want to show you what TMP looks like for a second here. You can see that it's rather lengthy, and the A is just the preamble to the whole very long license exception, and it imposes some restrictions. It refers you to a separate section of the EAR, 740.2, which is the general limitations on all license exceptions. And that section, this is why these things are confusing, you have to read that, and then you have to go look at 740.2. That section excludes MT items, 9X515 and 600 series items to certain countries. There are some other ECCNs that you also can't use it with. Highlighted those in the orange box on this slide. And also items that are subject to certain crime control and torture controls. So in order to use, the takeaway here is that in order to use this license exception, there are many different parts of the EAR that you have to review carefully to make sure that your item is not excluded from the scope of the license exception, and that you can go ahead and use the license exception. Okay, so what if TMP is not going to work for you? What could you do? So you've got items that are cannot go, no license required. TMP doesn't work for some reason. There are some other, or maybe it does, but it's complicated, and maybe you don't need to get into the weeds of TMP because one of these other license exceptions will work for you. For example, there is an exception for limited value shipments. As the name suggests, it only works when items are within a certain value. That value varies depending on the item, but you can find the relevant value by looking at the ECCN entry for the item. And if it says LVS and then a value number, you can use LVS, but only up to that value. If LVS is not listed there, then you can't use that exception. It's only valid for countries that are in country group B of the EAR. That's a lot of countries, but it does exclude some notable countries like Russia, for example. And there are some complicated reporting requirements for certain kinds of items that are specified in something called the sensitive list, which is yet another supplement to the EAR. So I'm afraid using license exceptions under the EAR, as some of you probably know from painful experience, you have to do a lot of thumbing back and forth or scrolling up and down to look at different sections to determine if you are eligible for it. But LVS might be a possibility for a trade show that just involves a few items of limited value if LVS is available for those ECCNs. There's another license exception that can come in quite handy, shipments to country group B, known as GBS. Again, the item's ECCN must have GBS listed under it. It must say GBS yes in order for GBS to be available. And GBS only allows shipments to country group B countries. But again, that's rather a long list, so this can be quite helpful. And then there's another license exception for technology. Technology is the EAR word for technical data, so we're talking about information, not hardware here. And it allows export of operation technology, but only the minimum necessary to operate the item, or sales technology, by which they mean the kind of information customarily supplied with a quotation or a bid or an offer that doesn't reveal any design or manufacturing technology. So very often for trade shows, if you have something that doesn't satisfy the limitations of marketing information, so it's not excluded from the regulations, but it is very minimal information, the kind of information you would customarily supply with a quotation, then you may be able to take that to the trade show using license exception TSU. And again, if you're going to use a license exception, you need internal documentation that you considered the conditions, that you determined that you could satisfy the conditions, and that you then went ahead and used the license for particular items, the license exception, and then you need to keep that on file for 5 years after the fact. If none of the license exceptions will work for you, for your trade show, then you can go and get an export license. Or you might decide to apply for an EAR export license just because trying to figure out if you can or can't use the exceptions is giving you a very big headache. Sometimes it's simpler just to ask for a license, although sometimes BIS will reject a license on the basis that you could use a license exception. So it doesn't always work, but sometimes you can choose to apply for an export license. If you do, then like ITAR and EAR licenses are all now valid for 4 years. So you have to keep an eye on the time. You don't want to find yourself planning to go to a trade show for which you got a license many years ago, and it turns out that license is no longer valid. So it's important to plan ahead and check. And again, like the ITAR licenses, the DSP-73 and the DSP-5 that we talked about earlier, they are only valid for the particular destinations that you specify, the parties that are on that license, the items, and they have quantity and value limitations that have to be respected. If you use it a lot and you keep exporting items that exceed the value, then the license is no longer valid, or the quantity, and again, the dates matter. And again, they may have conditions, additional conditions, license provisos that restrict exactly what it is that you can do under the license. They might restrict the capabilities of the items that you can take with you, for example. So important to pay attention to the provisos. And they take some time. It's not an overnight process, so you have to plan for that and give your compliance team fair warning. All right, so things that don't require any authorization, things that require ITAR authorization, and then things that require EAR authorization and how you go about getting those. That's what we've covered so far. These slides just show you some details of some of the exceptions. But at the beginning I mentioned that sometimes you might have incidental exports. In fact, this happens all the time. People take their laptops with them, their work laptops, their cell phones. Those have technical information on them. And so what can you do to authorize that? You have to have authorization. You can't just take your laptop out of the country if it has controlled information on it. So what do? Well, one new-ish, last few years solution is that if the data is encrypted to certain standards specified in the regulations, you encrypt the device and all the data on it is encrypted, and you satisfy those limitations, then you are not considered to be exporting the data under those circumstances. It is carved out from the definition of export. Again, you have to meet the standards, the right kind of encryption, not just any encryption will do. And there are some countries that you cannot use this for. So it doesn't apply with respect to Russia, and if it's an ITAR controlled situation, it doesn't apply with respect to those arms embargoed countries. So that's one possibility. There's also, under both sets of regulations, under both the ITAR and the EAR, something that's commonly referred to as the personal use exemption or exception. That's giving you the citations here. And those would allow you to travel with electronic devices containing technical information, even if they were not encrypted, but only on a temporary basis. So in the trade show context, that works quite well. It only works for U.S. persons and foreign persons who are directly employed by a U.S. person. So you couldn't use it, for example, for a foreign employee of a foreign subsidiary going to meet your U.S. team at a trade show. If they have U.S.-controlled information on their laptops or something, this exception wouldn't work for them. But in most cases, this is a decent solution. It doesn't work for 126.1 countries again. There's a list of those on this slide. And there are certain limitations in other parts of the EAR. For example, you may not be able to use it for embargoed countries, although you probably have other reasons not to go to those under other regulations. And there may be limits on certain countries for other purposes. So again, you always have to read the fine print of these license exceptions very carefully. And you have to take security precautions. So what do I mean by that? Okay, leaving your laptop open in the hotel room when the cleaning staff is coming. That would void the conditions of the license. We've seen situations, and this will probably strike you as extreme, but it does happen. I've had clients who were sitting in a taxi and the hard drive fell out of their laptop, and they didn't realize until they got to the airport. Under those circumstances, you better hope that it was encrypted, because if not, that's a bit of a mess. But so keeping custody of the item, making sure that it's safe, that it doesn't fall into anybody else's hands, not reading it in the lobby of a hotel where anybody behind you could read it, that would also void the conditions of the license exception. So there are limitations, is the key point. But it should work in most circumstances. Okay, so that is it, really. That's all I wanted to say today about export controls and export authorization. But when you go to a trade show, there are some things that you have to think about in addition to the export licensing. And one of those is ITAR brokering. So if you are in ITAR world, that is, if you are dealing with defense articles, then in addition to thinking about what you're taking and whether you're authorized to actually export it, it's worth giving some thought to whether there could be a brokering situation. Brokering under the ITAR is what traditionally people think of as arms dealing. That is facilitating on behalf of a third party, another party, not yourself, not your company, another party, the manufacturer or production, but those are not relevant here. At a trade show, what's relevant is soliciting or promoting, negotiating, arranging for potential sales of defense articles. That would be brokering. Now, if you're doing it on behalf of your own company and you're a full-time regular employee, that's carved out. That doesn't constitute brokering. But if you are sending a contractor to a trade show or a consultant to a trade show, they might be engaged in brokering if they are promoting your products, and you would have to think about the brokering rules. Similarly, if you decide to cross-promote another company's products, perhaps you sell UAVs and you install night vision cameras on those UAVs, but you don't produce the night vision cameras, somebody else does. Under those circumstances, you might be promoting a third party's product, that's action on behalf of another, to promote the sale of that item. That could raise a brokering issue. And so this has to be on the radar screen and the checklist. I'm going to come back to the questions at the end because I think we're going to have lots of time for those. So if you have a question, don't worry, I'm going to come to it. Okay, brokering. Another possibility, something else to think about, economic sanctions need to be on the radar screen. Now, economic sanctions, I assume everybody knows, but just very briefly, these broadly prohibit dealings with sanctions targets. What are sanctions targets? Certain countries that are subject to economic sanctions and parties who could be located anywhere in the world, but the U.S. government has determined that they're up to some kind of activity the U.S. government doesn't approve of. Could be drug smuggling, could be terrorism, could be undermining democracy in another country, some bad action that the U.S. government doesn't approve of, and imposes sanctions on them. If a target, if it's a country or a person who has been, or a company that's been subjected to sanctions, U.S. persons are generally prohibited from any kind of dealing with them, even dealings with EAR 99 items, even dealings that are free of charge. So how does that apply at trade shows? Well, if you are simply promoting with standard marketing materials that you haven't customized for anybody, then those would be carved out. You can provide those even to parties that are subject to sanctions, because the sanctions regulations include a carve-out for communications of informational materials. But if you were to take it a step further and actually start providing a service, getting into a more detailed discussion, really talking about how to sell something to a party, and that party is on one of the lists, that would be prohibited activity. And that could occur in any part of the world. So that is something that you have to give some consideration to. What can you do about that? You can't possibly screen everybody who's going to be at a trade show. But before you go, you can and should screen all of the known parties. So that would include the facility organizer, the place that you're going to be. There are, in fact, certain hotels and conference centers that are subject to sanctions, and it would not be permitted to go to such a place and use it for a trade show unless the government says otherwise. So that's unusual, but it does happen from time to time. And then what about people stopping by the booth? Well, you can't feasibly really screen everybody who stops by the booth. As I mentioned, you can provide information that is not subject to the regulations. But if you're going to have side meetings, more in-depth meetings, it seems like if a party is a good prospect, you want to have a follow-up meeting with them at the trade show or after the trade show, then that party should be screened to make sure they're not a sanctioned party, because otherwise you might be entering into a situation where you're providing a service or receiving a service from them, and that would be prohibited. Similarly, parties who are there with the trade delegation of a sanctioned country, Cuba, Iran, Syria, North Korea, the Crimea region of Ukraine, that would be a situation where you would want to talk to your compliance folks about the level of interaction that would be permissible with those parties. So sanctions can be important to consider at trade shows. There are also anti-boycott laws. Those laws prohibit U.S. persons and their foreign affiliates of various kinds that are part of the same control group from participating in an unauthorized boycott. The most common example of that is the Arab League boycott of Israel. And so there are certain countries that participate in that boycott. Trade shows in those countries can raise boycott issues, either because the contracts for participating in the trade show require you to do something that would violate the rules, or afterwards as you're negotiating contracts with customers from those countries. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but it's something that should be on the checklist. Something that is worth spending a little bit more time on is that, unfortunately, even when you're done considering U.S. export controls, your work is not done for a foreign trade show because, guess what, foreign governments have rules too, and when you want to take your stuff in to the trade show, there may be import controls imposed by that foreign country. And those import controls could really get in the way of what you want to do if you don't plan in advance. You might find yourself having the items confiscated by the foreign customs officers. So it's important to educate yourself. A quick word about Hong Kong. Hong Kong has its own control list that's very similar but not identical to the CCL, and it requires import and export permits for items that are on that controlled goods list. And the EAR requires you to comply with Hong Kong import restrictions. If you don't, then you're also violating the EAR, at least with respect to items that are controlled for specific reasons on the CCL: national security, missile technology, nuclear proliferation, and chemical and biological controls. So it's important to educate yourself on those foreign import controls. Some countries also have very unexpected import controls. For example, the UAE restricts the import of red laser pointers, which is the kind of thing that you might find lying around in quite a lot of people's luggage or planning for a trade show. So it is important to be aware of those controls. There's some guidance on this slide about how you can find out. Probably calling a law firm is the most expensive and least good option, at least as the first line. So what can you do? You can look at the web pages of FedEx and DHL. They have some guidance. The Department of State has some guidance. And, of course, Googling the particular country. Most countries will have an English language website, and you can learn about the import controls there. The last thing is foreign import duties. So what we were talking about a minute ago was foreign import permits, things that require authorization to go in and out. In addition to requiring authorization, many countries will seek to impose a tax on bringing things in and out of the country, an import duty. And there is a way to limit those import duties. You can purchase something called a carnet, sometimes called a goods passport. That does not substitute for import authorization. If a country requires a permit, then you have to get a permit. A carnet will not substitute for that. But the carnet will allow you to take the items in and out of the country without paying duty, as long as you comply with the conditions. Carnets are widely accepted in about 87 countries. Taiwan requires a special kind of carnet, but they're not a perfect solution. You have to pay for them. They're not free. The cost varies depending on the goods and the countries that you want to use them with. They're only valid for a year, and for trade shows, they're typically only valid for 6 months, so you have to get the items back within 6 months. And they only cover the items that are actually on the carnet. You have to take in, you have to bring out exactly what you took in. So they don't work for consumables. If you're giving things away, those can't be covered by the carnet. You may have to pay import duties on those. So it's important to plan around the import duties. Otherwise, the trade show can end up being a lot more expensive than you anticipated. What does all this add up to? Here's a little checklist. I'm not going to go through it blow by blow now. I'm going to turn to questions. But this really just lists the things that we've talked about in one place, a list of items to think about and consider as you're planning to attend a trade show, and then after you return from the trade show in order to ensure that you comply. It's focused on the export requirements and the sanctions requirements. It doesn't have entries for the boycott requirements because those may or may not comply. They only apply in limited circumstances. So it didn't seem worth putting them on the list. But that is something you should think about as well, and the carnet issues also. All right, let me see what kinds of questions we have here in the...
Talia, while you're going to address those, I'm just going to ask the operator to open the line for questions so we can get a couple of them queued up, and then you can go through some of those written ones that we have, and we'll go from there. You've answered most of my questions that I had, so I'm gonna take a step back today and allow you to address those questions and any other verbals that came in.
Okay, perfect. So let's see. Can we use LVS for trade shows? LVS requires orders. It's correct that LVS, the text of LVS requires you to have an order, but there are such circumstances in which you might have an order in a trade show context. So, for example, if you are arranging to take items to a trade show and then provide them to a customer, it may be that you are working with a third party on the trade show and that they're ordering items, and those items might fit under LVS in those circumstances.
Talia, we're going to let, just 1 second, we're going to let the operator just give the prompt to ask questions so she can get them queued up. Olivia, if you can give the instructions on how to present questions, please.
Sure. If you would like to ask a question, please press *1, unmute your line, record your name clearly. Your name is required to introduce your question. If you need to withdraw your question, press *2. Again, to ask a question, please press *1. Thank you.
Thanks, Olivia. While those are getting queued in, Talia, if you want to go to the next written question, and then Olivia will let us know when we have our first verbal question.
Okay, sure. There's a question, to what extent is an incidental export triggered if a U.S. person accesses controlled information via the cloud while in a foreign country when the controlled information is based on a U.S. cloud server? So if you are remotely accessing controlled information and that information is hosted on a server in the United States, whether it's in a cloud or whether it's in your company's, on your company's servers, it doesn't matter. If it's hosted on servers in the United States, then when you access that information, the information is being exported from the United States to whatever location you are sitting in. It might be a little bit different under Citrix and VPN. As a technical matter, I'm not sure that when you access via Citrix, I'm not sure that the electrons are actually traveling, so maybe there's no export, but that's a down-in-the-weeds kind of issue. But in theory, if the electrons are traveling to wherever you are, then the information is being exported. And you would need to have authorization for that. You can use, in most circumstances, the personal use exemption that we talked about, so long as you're not accessing the information in an insecure manner. So, for example, on an open wireless network in an internet cafe somewhere, on a hotel computer rather than your own computer, under those circumstances, you likely would not comply with the security requirements. And you would want to make sure, of course, that nobody else can see what you're doing while you're accessing the data. Another question, would you elaborate on sending contractors, consultants to trade shows? Yeah, so it is brokering to facilitate or to promote the sale, to solicit offers, to solicit bids, otherwise promote items for a third party. It is excluded if a person counts as an employee, a regular employee of the entity for whom they are doing the promoting. The problem with consultants and contractors is that they may not satisfy the definition of a regular employee. Now, it's going to depend on the contractor. It's a long-term contractual relationship and they work at the facilities of the entity and they're under the supervision and control of the entity, then they may satisfy the regular employee definition. But if they really are an independent contractor, and you wanted them to be so that they wouldn't be an employee, then you can't have it both ways, and they won't satisfy the definition of regular employee. If they're a consultant, they likely won't either. And under those circumstances, if they're promoting your product, they would be engaging in brokering. And if they are a U.S. person, then they would need to be registered for that brokering activity unless, the brokering regs are really rather complicated, unless one of the many and various exceptions apply to the situation, perhaps based on the item that is being brokered. If they're a foreign person and they are outside the United States, then under the brokering regulations as they exist today, this is different than from about a decade ago, foreign persons in that situation do not have to register as brokers. So it's the short answer is it's very fact-specific, but it is an issue to watch out for. Consultants and contractors can cause brokering headaches in certain circumstances.
Hold on one second, Talia. I'm just going to see if we have a verbal question. Olivia, did we have any questions that came in through the phone line?
We did. We have a question in queue from Anna. Your line is open.
Yes.
Hello, Anna.
Hi.
How are you?
Yeah, good. How are you?
Hi, Anna.
I'm with Maxim Integrated, and I would like to know, what would be the best way to find out the country of origin for all of the trade show attendees? Especially in a trade show in Europe with their European Data Privacy Act, the GDPR. Sometimes we're not allowed to ask those type of questions.
Yes.
And I have a question from the engineer that, are we allowed to give a sample to people from sanctioned countries? But then the thing is that we don't know who's from the sanctioned countries.
Right. So there probably isn't in most circumstances, and it depends on the trade show first. If it's a small industry group, then you may be able to determine who the attendees are. There may be, as you mentioned, depending on which country you're going to in Europe, there may be restrictions on their ability to tell you the nationality of individuals, but they ought to be able to tell you whether there will be any attendees from certain countries without connecting that information to particular individuals. They may not be able to tell you, and in most circumstances, you're pointing out a reality of the world that in many circumstances you won't be able to get that information. So what do? You are faced with this situation where you can give away information without worrying about economic sanctions, as long as that information falls within the carve-out for informational materials, which means items that are, it means many things, books, phonographs, a bunch of things that are published, but it also would mean, for example, marketing materials that are pre-prepared. You're not customizing them for any particular audience, for sanctioned country audiences. They are pre-prepared. You haven't made any special edits to them. Under those circumstances, they would count as informational materials, and they can be distributed without violating U.S. sanctions. Giving away freebies, gadgets, is a harder question.
Thank you for the question.
To make sure that the gadget. Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Olivia, do we have any other questions?
There are no questions in queue. As a reminder,
yes,
if you would like to ask a question, please press *1. Thank you.
Talia, did you have any other written questions? I don't see any on my end, but I think you probably had some via your chat. You don't see any others?
No. The ones that I answered are the only ones that have come in via the chat.
Perfect. Well, we'll give it another second or two for any other questions, but it's a good time for me to thank Talia. This is your second presentation you give to us. It was really informative. A lot of good information was covered. I did take a look, Talia, too, at your PDF. In the PDF, it is showing highlighted, for whatever reason, in this version on WebEx, it was kind of removing the letters so you couldn't see it, but the PDF that I have, you can see them clearly highlighted. You can see the letters behind that, so we'll get that out to everyone. Again, just to mention, tomorrow morning by 9 a.m., as we've done the last 2 weeks, we will get a copy of the recording, the net replay link, as well as the PDF copies of the presentations out to everyone. And then we just have one or two things from Tuesday I'm waiting on from our speaker for resource materials, but we'll get that out tomorrow morning. And I guess we'll give this the last chance for questions, Olivia. Any questions that have come in?
There are no questions in queue.
All right. Well, thank you, Talia, for presenting today, and I want to thank Wiggin and Dana as well. Everyone enjoy the extended weekend, and we're going to see you next week for Deemed Experts. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Participants,